it seems to relate back to this concept of acceptance, as you were talking about with acceptance and commitment therapy. And also you touched on the idea of seeing free will to not be what we think it is. You know, I think this concept of free will can often be this kind of part of the anxious ego that kind of wants to control the world. And instead, if you just see things are arising, and I better, the wise thing to do would be to accept them. That seems to be a real core of wisdom in this approach, right?
Absolutely. In fact, when they first used to talk about mindfulness-based approaches, they called them acceptance-based approaches. And there was mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and there's dialectic behavior therapy, and the third one was acceptance and commitment therapy. And these are, I mean, I'm calling them therapies, but they're almost like trainings as well. You know, whether you have a challenge or not, they're helpful. Acceptance is really at the core of it. And it's hard to accept if you believe in free will, actually, because things could have been different. You're much more likely to have regret because of, oh, you know what, yesterday I did my meditation, but if I paid a bit more effort and I tried a bit harder, it could have been better. Or I should have said that to that person. And then, your therapist or someone would say, learn to accept it and allow it. You're like, yeah, okay, but I definitely could have done better. But if we have the insight that actually all these choices and decisions are being made, are coming to me, just like everything's arising in consciousness, including choices and decisions, then the challenge of acceptance isn't so difficult. And the other thing that really helps acceptance is the transcendent self. If you believe yourself not to be the individual ego making choices and decisions and fighting through the world, trying to survive, and seeing yourself as actually, I'm the sky, and everything that's coming up are the different clouds that come and go. And all sorts of different clouds can come, all sorts of different weather can arise, and that's okay. That's much easier to cultivate an acceptance. So I guess I've been trying to teach acceptance and cultivate acceptance for years, and self-compassion. And it was only until the insight fortunately came that free will actually is a big illusion, that it became, the acceptance came with that quite naturally.
Yeah, I think they're naturally two sides of the same coin. The realization that you couldn't have done differently leads you to feel compassionate about the way the dominoes fell, and you think, oh well, how unfortunate for me that's the way it unfolded. But like, I'm not going to beat myself up about it because that was the way it went. And I think there's maybe an important distinction between this kind of fantasy idea of free will that is tied to harsh self-criticism, which is I could magically have transcended my circumstances and done something differently, which is just and rewrite the past. That's the version that's can't possibly be true, I think. But we do have a capacity to choose and to act in a way that's aligned with causes and our preferences. So you can absolutely learn from your experience from a place of compassion and notice, oh, I would prefer next time a similar situation arises to take this course of action. And that's something we can absolutely do. And so there's no fear here about the fact that you are just a little automaton being kicked around by the universe, especially when you realize that you are, it's far truer to say you are just that transcendent self, just the kind of consciousness observing. And then from that perspective, you have compassion for yourself, but also for others, right? And I'm sure this relates to the acceptance and commitment therapy. You see everyone's just being thrust into certain situations without kind of willing it to be that way.
Exactly. It just has such a huge impact on relationships massively. As you say, the compassion, first of all, it's much easier to cultivate self-compassion because of, as you say, you look to the past and say, actually, I couldn't have really done things differently because of those circumstances and situations. So I can accept that for myself, and I can be compassionate to myself rather than beat myself up about the choices that were made. But then also, I remember recently having a conversation with someone, and, that person was saying things that are not very pleasant. Let's say he was saying that I had a very big ego and I'd done this wrong and I'd done that wrong. And I just kind of agreed, because if I just saw this person, like the thoughts were coming up to their head and they saw it from that situation, and maybe I do have a big ego in that situation or for that circumstance. And it really it was like bursting a balloon in it, and it helped actually cultivate a much better relationship after that. So I think it can have such a great positive benefit when, first of all, remembering the transcendent self is what I am, what you are, what everyone is. So everyone, it's not like this person's good, this person's evil, and putting them into boxes, but actually everyone's coming from a place of good, if you want to call it that. And then much easier to be less judgmental and see how people's behavior is coming from their situation. And I always like to think that, if I replaced all of my cells with their cells and all of my genes with their genes and all of my, their experience and my experience, would I do anything different? Absolutely not. And that helps me when I watch Trump and his speeches, where I think actually that's been annoying me for a long time. But then when I thought, hang on a minute, if I was born in his family with his genes and all the situations, then I'd probably be making those annoying comments that he's making. So
yeah, I mean, that's
anyway.
Similar. That's the kind of one aspect of realizing the self is an illusion, I think, right? That we think, oh no, but James would not behave that way. James has some intrinsic essence that magically makes him impossible for him to behave badly. And that's just, a silly story I'm telling myself. If I was Trump, I would be Trump. Like it should be obvious, right? And there is no.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, exactly. I hope people would still listen. It'd be worth listening to if I magically transformed into Trump and was running this podcast. I'd love to hear him touch on these topics, because I think that's this idea of bringing awareness and mindfulness and the spaciousness of not reacting to your own emotions and self-compassion, bringing all this stuff into our interpersonal relations for a social species like us, these social primates, which so crucial are the way we interact with others. I think this is something I'm really glad that you're focusing on, because I think it's really hugely important, probably for the future of our species, that we can navigate away from unconscious, emotionally hijacked reactivity. To use someone like Trump as an example, he's an almost perfect textbook example of I would say, of someone who presumably has some deep emotional wounds and unconsciousness that leads to self-defensive reactivity rather than spacious self-compassion, like awareness, where there can be a kind of a vulnerability, right? There's clearly there's a kind of personality type he has, right, of narcissism, which is characterized by this incredible defensiveness and kind of blocking, even at the expense of making coherent sense. And just to use as an example, I think this is a spectrum from that way of being through to a kind of mindful, enlightened, I guess, in the limit way of being, that really has a knock-on consequence for our interactions with people. And so how, with acceptance and commitment therapy, is that something that you do with couples and things, or does it tend to be individuals?
So the beautiful thing about it is that the way it's been researched, it's not a program. So a lot of the research around mindfulness is a 6-week program or an 8-week program, and you have to try it with all sorts of different circumstances. But this was much deeper level research on how language and cognition works. And so it's 40 years of high quality research, and they found 6 different factors which impact our psychological flexibility. And I think there's 1,000 studies on this thing called psychological flexibility, which links to so many positive outcomes. But if we look at something like mental health, your level of psychological flexibility can predict how long a mental health challenge you'll have and how deep it will be and how easily you'll be able to get out of it, for example. And so there's these 6 flexibility skills, or you can think of them as pivots, because they don't have to take ages to develop. And if you cultivate these skills, it not only helps for mental health challenges, but also whether you have a business, or you can see it, or couples like you mentioned, or like even Olympic teams have used it to win gold medals. So they're universal principles that help the mind to work wherever the mind goes, and the mind goes everywhere where we go. And the 6 principles I've kind of used the acronym ACTION. So A is acceptance, C is cognitive diffusion. So it's the ability to unhook from our thoughts. And there's all sorts of very creative strategies they've come up with and tested really well. So we mentioned the I'm not good enough. And this is a universal, I find, for people. There's a thought that underlies a lot of our negative thinking, which is I'm not good enough, and I could have done better. And so one cognitive diffusion technique would be to sing that to the tune of Happy Birthday. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. And what happens is that first of all, people smile or laugh, but also you're actually changing the tone and the voice and the programming of that sentence, because it is just a set of sounds in the mind. We've added meaning to it, and it's having an impact. And I did that. I remember doing that in the early days when I discovered it. And now the idea I'm not good enough, it just doesn't have any emotional tone to it at all. It doesn't really have an impact on me at all. And but there's hundreds of these kind of exercises for that, for cognitive diffusion. T stands for the transcendent self. We've talked about that a lot. I stands for being in the moment. We've talked about that a lot. Then the O is opening up to your values. So it's about having a sense of clarity. What's really important to you? What do you really value? So I'm guessing you value, you know, good quality conversations and consciousness and awareness and research and truth. So, and if you do that in your work, or you spend time cultivating those values in the actions you do, that's really healthy for this flexibility. And so the final N of action, N stands for navigating towards this meaningful life through taking action. So it's a wonderful package, and it's even being used by the World Health Organization in refugee camps, actually, where they're training people in the skills of ACT, train the trainer type programs to help people in those circumstances, all the way through to, you know, businesses using it and measuring the psychological flexibility of our group. So it's really fun and interesting area.
Yeah, I think that I think it might be worth just driving home that last point you were saying about kind of self-compassion. You said the kind of I'm not good enough being a kind of universal. It makes sense that it's kind of useful if you want to be the best version you can be, that it might start off as a useful kind of module to have to be like, oh, improve next time, right? But I think, as you say, yeah, that most of us, I think we do live in a culture where instead of boosting each other up and encouraging self-compassion, that there tends to be, it's a bit of, I guess it's the rat race, competitive dynamic tends to lead to that message not really being promoted as much. And I'm sure there'll be probably people who are listening who unconsciously might have the reaction of, well, it's fine for you to be self-compassionate, but I'm like, there's some reason, but that's not for me. And I think if those people interrogate the you know, that's not for me part, they'll discover that there's some emotional blockage there that, you know, that doesn't need to be there. And as we spoke about before, with the lack of free will being a reason that self-compassion is something that can apply to everyone, I think this was a really life-changing moment for me. Was my wife gifted me a book from a writer she loves called Gay Hendricks, who's a psychologist, and it was a workbook called Learning to Love Yourself, and it's just kind of mindfulness-based practices of self-compassion. And I think, like maybe like most English men, if you look at that title, there can be this kind of feeling of like even hard to describe, but I think a lot of people would not, a lot of maybe not even men, just would not feel comfortable owning that book, or as something, it just sets off alarm bells of like you know, I think we don't even want to admit if we have issues around this stuff. And it wasn't until I read that book that I realized there was some deficit of not cultivating this perspective of self-compassion, and just reading this intelligent, kind of wise sounding man just say, yeah, it's fine to cultivate self-compassion, like it's useful, it makes you kind of less reactive emotionally, there's no reason you shouldn't. Like it was really like a bubble bursting of like, from a culture that keeps us kind of in check by not allowing us to kind of flourish fully in this way. So I think that's a really powerful message.